Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. I'm Simar Singh, representing the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Ned Meerdink. We are very grateful to the Lives and Dignity team for inviting us to speak with all of you today. So as Veronica mentioned, today's webinar will focus on self-reliance. Ned and I will start by setting the context for why self-reliance is particularly important at the moment. We will then collectively unpack what self-reliance means, and we'll hear from all of you about what it's looking like where you are working. We'll then discuss how to track progress towards self-reliance and why it's important and helpful to do so. And finally, we've kept a bit of time at the end for questions and comments, but we are going to try and keep this as interactive as possible. So I really encourage all of you to enter any questions you have, any comments or feedback that you have in the chat so that we can respond to them as they come up. With that, I'd also like to remind all of you to please mute your mic if you're not speaking. We will invite you to speak at some points during the session, but just so that we can all hear each other, please mute yourself. But also, we would love to hear a little bit more about each of you, where you're from, where you're joining us from, which organization you're working with. So please do introduce yourself in the chat so that we can all get to know each other. We don't have time to do introductions for everyone, but we'd love to have you just start introducing yourself in the chat. Great. So with that, maybe I'll do some quick introductions for myself and turn it over to Ned. Thanks, Ned. You can go to the next slide. Once again, I'm Simar Singh, and I am a senior program manager at Refugee. And in that role, I'm also the lead for the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative that I'll talk about a bit more today. Ned, over to you to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. Happy to be here. My name is Ned Meerdink. As you can see on the slide, I'm a senior program officer for an agency called Refugee. Simmer will talk a little bit about what Refugee does. But my core area of focus is supporting partners globally that are using a measurement tool called the Self-Reliance Index in order to track household level progress towards self-reliance over time within the context of all different sorts of humanitarian response operations. So I'll be back a little bit later in the presentation today to speak with you all. But yeah, thank you again for joining.
Great, thanks so much, Ned. And please, I see some people have already started introducing themselves in the chat. Thank you and welcome. For those of you who haven't, please do write your names, your organization, and where you're joining us from today. Thanks. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background about where Ned and I work, the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, or the RSRI, so that you know why we're here today talking to you about self-reliance. The Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative is a multi-stakeholder collaboration that promotes opportunities for refugees around the world to become self-reliant and achieve a better quality of life. In 2016, Refugee and the Women's Refugee Commission started bringing together and convening practitioners and policymakers to see how we could collectively advance self-reliance for refugees around the world. In the process, we've built a global community that includes over 45 partners. You can see some of those logos up on your screen. And this really, our community includes representatives from international and local humanitarian organizations, research institutes, think tanks, advocacy organizations, government donors, UN agencies, and private foundations. So we really are bringing together different actors who are all interested in moving forward self-reliance. If your organization is interested in joining a community of practice, you are most welcome to do so. We're an open network, and we'll share our contact information a bit later for those of you who would like to join. So the RSRI, this Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, is a global convening space for action, learning, and collaboration on self-reliance. We focus on knowledge exchange, and we bring together our network to build evidence, to share learning, and influence practice and policy to enable refugee self-reliance. Next slide, please. We do our work through three pillars, through three areas: measurement and analytics, learning for action, and policy influence. Through each of these work streams, we are building the evidence base of what works to help refugees become and stay self-reliant. We are working with our network to replicate and scale successful practices and approaches in different displacement contexts. And finally, using the evidence that we're generating and the learning that's coming from all of our partners, we use that to influence funders and governments to create policies that enable self-reliance for displaced populations. Next slide, please. So, you know, all of us are here because our work is connected in one way or another to advancing self-reliance. We wanted to share a little bit about who we are, this broader community of partners. And again, you're very welcome to join us. We are eager to hear from all of you about what self-reliance looks like in the countries and contexts where you're working. But first, it's helpful to take a step back and to look at the broader global context so we can situate self-reliance in humanitarian response and, you know, sort of better understand globally what this means. So first, this will not be new to any of you, but just to put it in context, the global displacement crisis is outpacing solutions. The number of displaced people keeps growing annually. Last year, there were 82 million people who were displaced. That number has definitely increased this year. It doesn't include numbers from the more recent displacement crises in Afghanistan and Ukraine. Climate change is accelerating the growth and pace of displacement. So again, the number keeps growing. Those who are displaced are remaining so for longer periods of time. 80% of all refugees are now displaced on average for 10 to 25 years. And the system that was set up to provide solutions for refugees is unable to keep up. In recent years, less than 3% of refugees have been able to access a durable solution. So less than 3% of refugees in the last few years have been able to get resettled to a third country, to return home, or to legally integrate into their host country. The 97% who are unable to access these durable solutions are left in a state of limbo, waiting for durable solutions that may never materialize in their lifetime or may take decades to happen. So, you know, all of these statistics are important for us to look at because it helps paint a global picture of what's happening. I know we all hear the news and we read these articles year after year saying this is the worst year for the displacement crisis. And it's true, it has been getting worse every year in terms of the scale and the scope of the crisis. And really beyond all of these statistics, I think all of you probably have a very clear sense of what all of this means for the displaced people that you're working with. The fact that more people are being displaced, they're staying displaced for longer periods of time, and they're not able to access those long-term solutions. Next slide, please. Looking at the displacement crisis in another way, when we think of the system that exists to support the humanitarian system that exists to support people who are displaced, there's $30 billion that's spent on humanitarian assistance every year. And the vast majority of that money goes to emergency aid that is short-term and again, really not built to support people who are displaced for many years, for 10 to 25 years. Most of the funding in the humanitarian system is really intended to provide that initial emergency aid. So what we need clearly is a different approach for the 97% of refugees who will not be able to access a durable solution. We need an approach that supports them to rebuild their lives, to utilize their skills, and to contribute to the communities that they live in, while also strengthening their long-term resilience. And so, as I was saying, while the trends grow more and more dire each year, and we know that the broader system that we're working with is not keeping up, this is not new. We've been on this trajectory for a while. As you can see on your screen, in 2016, so already many years ago, ahead of the World Humanitarian Summit, the UN Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, wrote that millions of people are trapped in dependency on short-term aid that keeps them alive but falls short of ensuring their safety, dignity, and ability to thrive and be self-reliant. What we need is a fundamental shift in our approach that preserves the dignity and improves the lives and self-reliance of displaced persons. So he sort of captured this problem, or sort of the situation that we find ourselves in. He captured it very well. And again, this was many years ago. So we've all been talking about, how the humanitarian system cannot keep up with the displacement crisis for quite a while. And we all agree that there's a shift in approach. So the shift in approach, that's where self-reliance comes in. Self-reliance is not a new concept. It's been around for many years. And globally, it is being recognized as a key solution to this growing displacement crisis. Self-reliance is one of the 4 objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees, which was affirmed by almost every country at the United Nations. Self-reliance is also at the heart of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. So it's recognized, at the highest levels in terms of being an important objective. But perhaps most importantly, self-reliance is what refugees tell us that they want for themselves. That's, I think, really important to emphasize here. This is not just an idea that global policymakers have come up with, that someone invented. It's really something that we hear again and again from refugees and displaced people. I'm sure it's what all of you have heard from the communities that you support. For us, in our work, we've repeatedly heard from the refugees that we work with that they are tired of being dependent constantly on short-term aid, but instead what they really want is a chance to work, a chance to provide for themselves and for their families, and to rebuild their lives in their host countries. So again, that's really where self-reliance fits into the larger picture, and why all of us are here today. Next slide, please. But despite being recognized as an important objective, there are still many gaps that remain in moving the humanitarian field towards self-reliance. Some of them are up on your screen. We're still learning as a community what actually works best to help different displaced communities in different contexts become and stay self-reliant. We are in the early days of collecting data about the impact of self-reliance programs. And so far, we're also in the early days of being able to share what we're learning. And efforts like the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative and the Lives and Dignity Grant Facility, with its effort and emphasis on learning, are really trying to fill in some of these gaps. Beyond that, it's also important to mention, and this is something I think all of you will be very aware of, it's still quite difficult in practice for many displaced people to become self-reliant because of restrictive policy environments. Many countries deny refugees and displaced people the right to work and to access social services. And as mentioned before, for the bigger humanitarian system, most of the funding is geared towards short-term aid, which is not really well set up to help people become self-reliant. So there's still quite a few challenges that remain. But that's where all of us come in. And I know that a lot of the projects that all of you are working on are really trying to address some of these gaps. Next slide, please. So we've talked about why self-reliance is important globally, how it's a key objective of the Global Compact on Refugees. But what is self-reliance? How do we describe it? What does it mean to be self-reliant in the context of displacement? Let's unpack this together.